Welcome back, family, to Black House Live's book lecture series. We are still discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. Our last lecture focused on Chapter 12, The Economic Order and Power, where we discussed the ways in which the white corporate elite has been able to control the economy in and for their own interests, even as America's control over the global economy has declined. If you'll remember a few lectures back, even we've been discussing the collective consciousness of the corporate white elite, right? And that Dr. Wilson makes the argument that the corporate white elite is the most conscious, the most class conscious, right, of all classes in America. And so building on this argument that African people must collectively organize themselves, right, around our ethnicity, around our cultural resources, right? Dr. Wilson continues in that vein and in making that argument, showing us how white folks have collectively come to see themselves as a class and are daily, annually working towards achieving their political and economic interests, right? As a collective, we too, as an African people, should be doing similar things. And so in this lecture, we discuss the ways in which ethnicity can be used as power both on the global and local levels. And Wilson encourages African people to organize ourselves around ethnic, cultural, and social characteristics that we share as a group. And so Wilson provides several examples of other ethnic groups that have used their ethnic commonalities to organize themselves for power. So I'm excited for us to jump right into chapter 14, Race and Economics. Social relations and economics. According to Dr. Wilson, an economic system exists when its members choose to enter into ongoing organized social relations of exchange with each other based on complementary or mutual interests, purposes and values, tastes, means of production, and a function of trust and fidelity, right? So an economic system does not exist simply because of the mere presence of groups and individuals possessing and controlling commodities or items of use and value or money which other members or classes may desire to possess or use. Again, this is the point of departure for Amos Wilson, where others argue that an economy exists merely based on groups' possession, right, of commodities, resources, right, that other non-group members wish to possess, right? Wilson argues that an economy is a mutually agreed upon system, right? The members of a particular society agree on the way in which they're going to exchange, right, those goods and those values. Now, that agreement may not have been amongst equals, right? That agreement may have become legitimized through a people's continual use, right, of that system and acquiescing to that system, right, that have come to legitimize it. But however, we want to see that those members in that society have acquiesced to that system. They're mutually agreeing to engage by the rules of that particular system. And thus, that's what makes it an economic system, right? Not the mere possession of goods. According to Dr. Wilson, economies are best formed when they are established within a group which shares a common ethnic group or national identity. So for those groups that already have certain qualities and characteristics that align them, right, economies are best formed amongst those individuals. Wilson argues that white capitalism, which erroneously gets referred to as mere capitalism, is such an economic system, right? White capitalism is an economy that was established among white folks that share a common identity. And according to Wilson, Wilson argues that white capitalism is an economic system of social relations and social power which exploits and victimizes blacks. This is the ideology that allows white folks to align themselves, to coalesce themselves around that particular ideology. Right? Wilson argues that blacks will only transform this situation of white capitalism and its dominance over black people, right? Once we transform the nature of the way in which we relate and interact with these folks, right? Once we change the rules of how they engage with us as individuals and as a community, right? But also once we change the nature of the property and power relations, right? That makes up this relationship between whites and blacks. So in like our first three lectures, we talked about the need of African people the world over of acquiring property by any means necessary. Dr. Wilson says that is the most important thing on the agenda for African folks, right? And so when we discussed in lectures 1 and 2 that the African people the world over have to be about the business of acquiring property by any means necessary. Ethnic, cultural identity, and economics. So in lectures 4 and 5, we discussed the ways in which African culture and personality has been socialized by white racist propaganda. This socialization process was so that African people as a culture and as a class would identify politically and economically with white interests and not their own. Wilson argued that the African culture and personality needs to be re-socialized so that we begin to look more inward and we begin to prioritize our own economic and political interests. Wilson goes on to define identity. He argues that identity is achieved then as a result of an identification process. In this identification process, this is where the individual or group comes to perceive herself as possessing a unique personality or character of being a person or group in his or her own right and being able to answer to their own satisfaction, right? And so identity is achieved at the individual or group level, right? Once the individual or group comes to recognize themselves as being unique in some type of way, right? They possess a unique personality. Their personality is not like that of the dominant culture, right? Wilson reminds us that identity is an instrument of power. It's an instrument of and for personal, group, and cultural survival, right? And so if the individual wants to survive in this current white, dominant, racist, sexist society, right, it's important for the personality to be mature in a particular type of way. The personality is going to, the African personality is going to survive in this current society that we look at, right? It's going to be important for the African personality to be able to associate itself, align itself with the African personality, the collective, right? And so Wilson argues that group identity is achieved when each member of the group holds the group and its other members in the highest regard relative to other groups and to other members, right? So African folks have to see the African group, right, as more important than any and all other groups. We have to put the interests of the African group before the interests of any other group. The advancement and the defense of his or her group's interests are synonymous with, or more important even than his or her own. We then start to sacrifice our individual needs, our individual wants, right? Our individual desires for the needs and long-term goals of the group. All right. And again, this is a part of that identification process, which is a part of that socialization process. All right. So again, if you have not seen our lectures on chapters 3 and chapter 6, I strongly recommend you to go back, check those out as we talk about the ways in which the African culture and African personality has been socialized for white interests and the need for a new African culture, the need for a new African personality, right, to align with our new political and economic interests. Dr. Wilson argues that identity is a political economic entity, meaning that as a political economy, identity is an organization of interests. It's an organization of tastes, desires, passions, ideals, motives, values, knowledge, abilities, and skills. Wilson argues that identity is much like social consciousness, in that social consciousness is the awareness of one's identity or relatedness to others, right? And so, if social consciousness is the awareness of one's identity and relatedness to others, right, then identity um, uh, connects an individual, right, to the ways in which they relate not only, right, to themselves, but how they relate to the group. Wilson argues that identity is much like social consciousness, in that social consciousness is the awareness of one's identity or relatedness to others, to the group, the awareness of mutual interests, and self acknowledgement and maintaining certain behavior, enhancing and advancing the interests of the group which one identifies and is a member of. So, with this identifying ourselves with a group, we recognize that certain behaviors then come behind that. Right? Once you now start to identify yourself as a part of a particular type of group, right, you then start to behave in a particular type of manner. All right. You can't continue to behave as an individual, right? And saying that you are moving and working in the interest of the group and the collective. Dr. Wilson argues that since we know the relationship between identity and social consciousness, then like group consciousness, group identity is developed easiest from groups that share a common ethno-cultural background, right? Um, Groups are going to be able to form an identity amongst a people who share a common language or share a common religion, right? Who have some commonalities that they share. And so, group identity, a group consciousness, according to Wilson, provides the means for the group to develop coherent and cohesive social, cultural, religious, political, economic, or military organizations. And these organizations are the instruments of the group's survival, right? They are instruments of the group's influence, wealth, prestige, and control. Right? So if we are going to call ourselves a nation and we are going to engage with all other nations, right, as if we are a nation, then there are certain institutions and organizations that we're going to have to establish. And in order for us to establish those organizations and those institutions, we have to, right, on the individual level, recognize that we are a part of a collective. We have to be conscious of our group. We have to be conscious of our class as business people. And if we are not conscious of the goals of the group and the work that we must be doing as a group, right, then we can effectively undermine the work that one is trying to do. Group identity and group consciousness is reflected in the business and organizations that they establish and how they influence their internal and external communities, right? And so we can almost measure the extent to how developed a group's identity is, right? How effective a group's identity is, right? We can measure how effective a group's consciousness is based on how well organized their businesses, their organizations, and their institutions are. If the organizations and the institutions are a symbolic representation, right, of a group's identity and a group's consciousness, then how those organizations and how those institutions run, how they flow, right, day to day is going to be a direct reflection, right, of a group's identity and consciousness. Global tribes. Citing Koskin's book, Tribes, How Race, Religion, and Identity Determine Success in the New Global Economy, Wilson argues that ethnicity is the X factor in the evolution of the global economy. Wilson argues that other ethnic groups like Jews, the British, the Japanese, the Chinese, and Indians, as global tribes, combine their strong sense of common origin and share values and do not surrender their ethnic identity for anyone, while utilizing their values and beliefs to cope with changes in the world, right? Whether they are political, economic, cultural, and social. And so, what Wilson is pointing out here is that global tribes, such as the Japanese, the British, the Chinese, right, they don't shed their ethnic origins. They don't feel the need to hide those things that make them different, those aspects of their personality, those aspects of their culture that makes them unique. They don't shed those. In fact, they utilize them, right? and allow them to be able to deal with the ever-changing political economy, right? The ever-changing economic, cultural, and social economy, right? It is going to be their cultural values, right, that allow them to be able to respond to these particular types of changes. All right. Wilson argues that global tribes share following characteristics. A global tribe has an ethnic identity and a sense of mutual dependence, right? This ethnic identity is where these folks recognize that unless we depend on each other, unless we utilize each other, we will not survive. All right. A global network is based on mutual trust that allows the tribe to function collectively. Again, um, this group's consciousness is one where they recognize that if less we trust each other, our success or our potential for success is decreased if we're not working together. But as long as we are working collectively, right, we're trusting the work that we're doing as a group, then our potential for success increases. A third characteristic of global tribes is that they have a passion for technical knowledge and open-mindedness towards cultural and scientific development and innovation. For some reason, there tends to be the stereotype or prejudice amongst developing nations as if they are adverse to technology, that these folks are adverse to machines and prefer doing manual labor and things of that nature. Dr. Wilson and others completely destroys that argument here, right? There is a passion for technical knowledge that is going to help them achieve parity with other nations, to be able to compete with other nations, right? All folks want that. All nations of people are looking for that, and also have an open-mindedness towards cultural and scientific development. And so, at one point in time in our history, where certain civilizations and dynasties kind of shunned the outside world, right? Because they thought that they were either infidels or that they were devils or they were despotic or barbarians, right? Whatever the word, the adjective that you want to use, you had nations that kind of shunned outside influences. And what Wilson and others are saying here is that global tribes share this passion for an open-mindedness towards culture and scientific development, because they recognize with that new knowledge, right, is going to only mean increased possibilities for their nation. Let's keep moving. Global economic network of the ethnic Chinese. Dr. Wilson spends the rest of the chapter proving that other ethnic groups have historically used ethnicity and their ethno-cultural history to form businesses and political alliances, right? So Dr. Wilson doesn't encourage us to do anything that he has not seen historically done anywhere. He's not going to encourage African people to somehow do something that has not already been done somewhere in history. And so if he's encouraging us as African people to use our ethnicity, right, to develop our power, he's going to provide us with, and he does provide us with, other examples of where this has been done before in history. And so he starts here with the Chinese. Wilson argues that the immigrant Chinese entrepreneurs have been operating comfortably within a network of family, laying a foundation for stronger links amongst businesses across national borders. The Chinese own businesses across East Asia, the United States, and Canada, right? So these Eastern Chinese are not keeping their business dominance, right, solely within the Chinese parameters or the Chinese borders, right? They are establishing businesses in the United States as well as in Canada as well. Dr. Wilson explains that there are Chinese concepts that are important to know in order to function effectively in China. One such concept is referred to as guanxi, which translate into personal connections. We just looked at in that last slide, we're talking about how the ethnic Eastern Chinese are able to operate inside of their clan and their family, right? This term guanxi, which translate into connections, right? It's all about who your family is connected to, who your family knows. And so, citing Chu, uh, Wilson argues that the importance of influential contacts is characteristic of all Asian societies. So whether we're talking about the Japanese, we're talking about Cambodians, right? There is a particular aspect of Guanxi that flows throughout all Asian society, right? Without being too romantic, the old adage that it's not what you know, it's who you know is a way of life in Chinese society, according to Chu. Dr. Wilson argues that the primary importance of ethnic identity and consciousness and the types of economic relationships created as a result are well illustrated by the economic success stories of the ethnic Chinese and other ethnic groups in America. We're going to see the benefits, right, of working within your own family, working within your ethnic clan, right, to achieve your political and economic goals. According to Dr. Wilson, the economic reality for the African American community will radically change once there has been a radical change in the social relations between African Americans. We must first change the way in which we see ourselves, the way in which we interact with each other, right? Before other groups of people are going to change the way in which they see us and how they interact with us. The African American community is going to have to change the ways in which we engage with each other professionally and politically, right? We're gonna have to develop some ground rules for what business looks like in our community, right? Who we do business with, who we don't do business with, um, who we are going to run for office, who we're not going to run for office, right? These are discussions, uh, political and economic planning that needs to be happening on a local, national, and international level. And it's just not happening in the ways in which they need to. Until we are willing to do business with each other, until we organize ourselves as a class conscious community and create and enforce the rules of economic and political engagement, then that's the only way we'll see the radical change that we want to see. Right. But until we create those mechanisms for self, until we start to do some of that heavy lifting for ourselves, right, we won't see a change in our community. We'll continue to see white dominance. Wilson goes on to show how ethnicity has played a historical role in economically empowering groups, whether it was the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Incas, the Mayans, right? Whether it was the Chinese, the Aztecs, the Ghanaians, or the Islamic empires, Wilson was able to demonstrate the economic and political outcomes of a strong sense of an ethnic cultural identity. These folks understood themselves to be traders. They understood that they possessed resources that other people needed and they did not have. And if they were going to maintain their dominance, if they were going to maintain their strategic geopolitical positioning in the world at that time, then they were going to have to force other nations to engage and interact with them on their own terms. And we as African people have not yet done that. Wilson argues that there is a correlation between nationalism and globalism. Wilson showed that despite predictions of the decline or even the end of nationalism with the expansion of global economies, right? So as businesses started to expand into other countries and these countries now started to do business with each other, the argument about nationalism declining, right? We start to see that an increase in those particular types of arguments. But Wilson showed that despite predictions of that decline or even the end of nationalism, right, there's actually been an expansion of global economies, right? There's actually been an expansion and the increase of nationalism, right? Nationalism is flourishing in the midst of expanding global economies, despite the predictions of the opposite happening. The local tribe. Dr. Wilson explains that ethnic economic networks exist on the local level as well as the global level. Wilson explains that ethnic economic networks are nothing new to America. Groups in America who utilize their ethnic identity and consciousness to catapult themselves into national and international fame and fortune are widely known. And so for the rest of this chapter, we're going to look at the local examples, right, of ethnic groups having economic prosperity. So let's look at the Koreans. As of the printing of this book, Dr. Wilson argues that Korean immigrants have built a thriving community of nearly 400,000 in Southern California, the largest concentration of Koreans outside of Korea. As of today, as of 2022, California and New York have the highest concentration of Koreans outside of Korea. Dr. Wilson argues that the not guilty verdict for the 4 police officers videotaped beating motorist Rodney King revealed the depths of Korean economic dominance. Wilson argues, using a journal, the Wall Street Journal, printed during that time, reported that an estimated 20% of the area's Korean American businesses, or about 2,000 companies, sustained damage or was destroyed. If this data is accurate, Wilson estimates that the Koreans must have owned some 10,000 businesses in the area. That is a very powerful number, right, to conceive of. But even more so than the number of businesses that was developed in the area was that here is a relatively small immigrant group that has not been in the country that long, right? And in just one American city has been able to amass 10,000 businesses, right? Dr. Wilson is going to juxtapose this type of economic development in such a short amount of time, right, to the lack of economic development amongst African American people. And so we want to hold that up while we recognize this success and we're looking at these ethnic success stories. They're meant to be juxtaposed against the lack of African American economic dominance as well, right? So let's keep moving. Dr. Wilson explains that while we all may be familiar with the business success of Koreans in America, we are not as fully informed of their transformational success into political power. Wilson argues that the basic foundation of Korean economic success and political transformation are the Korean-centered organizations, such as the Korean American Small Business Service Center of New York, or the Korean American Grocers Association of New York. There's the Korean Produce Association and the Korean Association of Greater New York, the KAGNY, which today a Korean association exists in every state where there is a significant Korean population. And so across the United States, you'll see that the Korean American population has been able to organize itself, not just for economic power, right, but for political power as well. Through the economic success of these individual business opportunities, it allows them to raise funds, right, to be able to put up their own politicians and run their own candidates. All right, so you'll remember in one of our last lectures, Dr. Wilson talked about the idea that there can somehow be political power, right, in a community without there being simultaneously some economic power is fallacy, it's fantasy. And we're seeing how other ethnic groups also understand that. They understand that they have to have the economic with the political. Dr. Wilson argues that Korean economic and political success has not been without consequence to the African American community. Wilson argues that Korean American public relation initiatives towards the African American community is to camouflage or to hide their continuing and growing Korean commercial exploitation of the Black community. Wilson argues that their public relations campaigns and lobbying and buying of Black elected officials are just simply a blatant attempt to use those representatives to advance Korean interests at the expense of the African Americans, right? By making vague promises to enter into joint ventures with African American business persons, right? Or insultingly designed to trick the African American community into foolishly aiding and abetting its own economic exploitation and retardation. And so Dr. Wilson is making the argument here is that many of the promises that were made by Korean businessmen and women, right, to jointly join and partner with other African businesses did not happen. And many of these Korean business leaders were trying to, according to Wilson, they insultingly assumed that African people were going to naively join into these partnerships at the expense of their own economic and political interests, right? And so in this chapter, Dr. Wilson provided several examples of Korean American immigrants in their social relations initiatives, whether that would be uh, donating money to certain Black organizations or putting money in the pockets and in the political pockets of particular Black candidates, right? In the hopes of those Black politicians advancing Korean interests, right? Advancing Korean economic and political interests. Dr. Wilson is saying that we have to challenge that type of benevolence, that type of ethnic group benevolence, right, into our Black community. No one is looking to do a deed for Black folks without getting something to show for it, right? And a lot of times, the things that are being waved in our face as solutions or things that are going to save us, a lot of times are nice, fancy tricks that end up aiding the dominant culture, right, in their dominance over us. Solutions. The African American community must resist and overthrow its conditioned addictive needs to be loved by other ethnic groups who can only love it to the extent that they can exploit its commercial and economic potential. Wilson argues that even if the love was genuine, the community is in no way obliged to impoverish itself, neglect and abuse its children, literally sacrifice its physical and psychosocial body politic by giving away its wealth in a bargain with the devil to gain that love, right? So Wilson is saying that there are no groups that have this blind love for Black folks, and thus this idea that we just willy-nilly, right, love all groups of people before they have proven themselves, right, worthy of our love, is detrimental, right? And then secondly, Wilson says, right, the only way that these groups can truly love us, they love us to the point to which they can exploit us. And if they can't exploit us, there's no use for us, right? We have to consciously and critically wake up and analyze the situation for what it was. Dr. Wilson goes even further. He says, even if the love was genuine, we have no obligation to sacrifice the future of our children and the future of our children's offspring, right? Due to our love and in our infatuation for non-group members. If it comes down to it, where non-group members have to decide between feeding their families and feeding our families, right? I would venture to believe that non-group members are going to choose to feed their families. And so Dr. Wilson is saying that we are under no obligation to put the interests of other individuals before the interests of ours, our children, and the children of our future offspring. The African American community's dedicated use of its wealth to maintain the employment, health, and welfare of its members and its children, to socially and economically improve itself through the preservation and use of its resources as allocated through its own social, cultural, and economic institutions, should have absolutely little to do with permitting Korean and other communities free and full access to its marketplaces, only to economically exploit it while pretending to love it. We have to have some type of systems put into place, right, where folks who are doing business in Black communities, right, there's some type of rules of engagement. All right, we can't just let non-Black businesses have unfettered access to our community. All right, the African American community is dedicated. We have to be dedicated to the wealth maintenance, right? The employment maintenance, the health and welfare maintenance of our community. That's not the work of any other group of people. Despite their promises, despite the rewards and the gifts and the trinkets that they say that they will deposit into our communities, that work and those roles are our responsibility. And we cannot sacrifice that and give up that work to anybody else. Koreans in politics. Dr. Wilson argues that Korean Americans have been organizing themselves numerically for political power. Citing an article from a 1993 New York Times paper, Wilson argues that Korean immigrants are banding together to push their concerns by voting as a bloc. Using the 1993 mayoral race as an example, the article expressed how the mayoral candidates recognized the importance of campaigning amongst Korean Americans because the Korean Americans were becoming so politically and economically organized. Those candidates that were campaigning for mayor in 1993 recognized that they had to go see those Korean Americans. Right? They had to include them into their campaign strategy. And so to just demonstrate how effective this organizing for political and economic power has been for Korean Americans, Wilson cites the Times article saying that Korean business owners had on their agenda the squashing of a city plan for zoning changes that would allow bigger food stores into the city, right? So those Korean American immigrants were able to organize themselves, right, and place at the foot of those politicians, either through the use of lobbying and other sources, as we talked about, right, in chapters 8, right, that one of their political agendas was that they wanted the zoning plans, the political plans for zoning. They wanted that to be wiped out. The plan to incorporate new, bigger food stores that were going to compete with their Korean food stores, right? They challenged those. They wanted those politicians to do something about it. They also wanted these politicians to lobby to crack down on illegal food vendors. Dr. Wilson argues that Korean Americans in New York during the 1993 mayoral run promised to deliver 6,000 votes to the candidates whose stance on street vending seemed best. The then president of the Korean American Grocers Association and his organization was seeking to force the city to crack down on illegal vendors and better regulate the legal ones. According to Wilson, the irony in this demand is that a very large number of the vendors the association wished to run out of town, right, or that they were seeking to restrict, were those of African origin. They were seeking to run these African or African American vendors off the streets. The argument was that these vendors were taking away their business. They were taking away their customers. And Wilson says, all right, a very large number of the vendors the association wished to run out of business or that they were seeking to restrict are those of African origin having to vend in the streets for a living as a result of Korean and other ethnic groups' monopoly of physical store space. The irony of this whole situation, right, was that, we talked about these 10,000 businesses controlled, bought, and owned by Korean American immigrants in Southern California. With them monopolizing the buying of the store physical space, these African and African American business owners are left to vend in the street, are left to survive to vend in the streets for a living as a result of Korean and other ethnic groups' monopoly of the physical stores in the communities where their customers are almost 100% Black. So the Korean Americans are competing with the African immigrants or the African American vendors, right, for the same Black business, for the same Black dollar. Dr. Wilson explains that shortly after the Korean Association of Grocers demanded a crackdown on illegal street vendors, the New York political apparatus capitulated to these demands. Wilson reports that the Dinkins administration announced it would step up its efforts against the 10,000 unlicensed street vendors. The mayor announced that he would assign 36 additional police officers to an already 46-member peddler enforcement unit and would deploy, along with 12 additional vans and trucks, 31 more city inspectors, as well as other personnel. Listen, when them Koreans said that they would turn out 6,000 voters, right? So the politician who had the best plan for how they were going to deal with these illegal street vendors, these mayoral candidates went to work. They started climbing over each other over who could come up with the best policy or come up with the best practice that was going to handle these illegal black street vendors. The mayor announced he would assign 36 additional police officers. We'll put more boots on the ground. Dr. Wilson argues that blacks made up 95% of the customers along 125th Street, which is one of New York City's major commercial streets. Supports a host of store owners, shopkeepers, professional services, and other businesses, 95% of whom are non-black. So 125th Street, the majority of the individuals who live there in that community, right? The majority of the individuals who are poor in that community are black folks, but all of the businesses are ran and controlled by non-black people. Wilson argues that black street vending was an attempt at economic entrepreneurialism, an attempt of the black community to capitalize on its own wealth in order to meet the basic and vital needs of its constituents. Wilson argues that the street vending market attracted many tourists, and visitors spent an estimated $300 million annually with the vendors. Street vending, according to Dr. Wilson, because these black folks could not occupy, buy, or afford physical store space, their economic resiliency took them to the streets, and they were able to eke out a living by street vending in the streets. Many tourists and visitors spent an estimated $300 million annually with the vendors. And we recognize that these Korean American immigrants were very upset about this. They did not want to have to share this $300 million with anybody, let alone these illegal street vendors. Let's keep going. They say hindsight is 2020. Dr. Wilson claims that the black street vendors were the lifeblood of 125th Street. Their presence attracted customers not only to themselves, but also to the in-store merchants who complained that the street vendors were taking away their business from them. In all actuality, the street vendors were actually bringing business to, right, these non-black storefront owners. These street vendors were bringing business to these folks. And yet they wanted to wipe them off the streets. Dr. Wilson argues that the case of the street vendors demonstrate the absence of an intention by the non-black merchants and business people who do not live in the community, who do not contribute financially, materially, or socially to the community, and who are generally racially hostile towards its inhabitants. Right? The movement to eradicate and displace those black street vendors, right, according to Wilson, is just one of the many examples of there not being a larger commitment by the local or the national government to invest in black businesses, to invest in the black community, to invest in the financial, material, and social development of those particular communities, right? Wilson has said that this is an example of their hands-off approach to the development of black economics and black politics. Dr. Wilson argues that the 125th Street black vendors case symbolizes the condition of black entrepreneurs all around the world. Wilson argues that black entrepreneurs are outsiders in their own markets, as alien merchants in markets dominated by black consumers. How ironic. On 125th Street, where predominantly all the people who reside there are black folks, yet black business people are shut out of being able to compete in communities, right, or in markets that have predominantly black consumers. How ironic. So then, based off of what we've been talking about, Wilson argues that it should be obvious that if the worldwide African community is to achieve economic self-sufficiency and self-respect, if it is to wield sufficient political and economic power to protect its vital interests in similar ways, right, that the ethnic Korean and corporate white elite class, right, has been able to do so to enhance its quality of life, then its current economic posture relative to other economic groups in its midst and with whom it does business must be radically reversed, right? We are going to have to change the way in which we do business in our community. We're going to have to change the way in which we relate to each other, right? Um, the ethnic examples that are uh, displayed, demonstrated, and articulated in this chapter are examples that we as African people, the world over, are going to have to take into our orientations. Wilson argues that the African community, despite its long tradition of sharing with all strangers who enter its gates, must face up to the fact that it does not owe non Africans a living at the expense of its own economic viability. Historically, we have been a group of people who have extended our arms, right, to outsiders. We welcome them to the community. We share our resources. And Wilson and others have claimed, right, we've done that a lot of times at our own disservice, at our own detriment, right? When we analyze Christopher Columbus's diary, he talks about how easy it was for him to subjugate these indigenous people because of how welcoming they were, right? And so the black community simply cannot support itself and everybody else at the same time. Other ethnically related nations and economically interdependent groups have recognized the same fact relative to themselves. While other ethnic groups may recognize, right, that they are marginalized by a dominant white, right, that they are not allowed or seen and viewed in the national body politic in the same exact way, right? They don't open their doors and open their arms to non-group members, right? They don't fall victim to this multicultural worldview that the dominant culture tries to lay at the feet of Black oppressed people, right? We have no responsibility to any other groups of people besides our group members. And so while globalization is occurring at breathtaking pace, so is regionalization, according to Wilson. Regionalization is defined as the joining of nations, often ethnically and culturally related, to form regional trade blocs and associations for advancing and protecting the economic self-interest of their members. In the same way that globalization is expanding, right? Where folks are moving around, right, in other countries, businesses are moving around to other countries, and it creates this triangular relationship between the mother country, right, and the newly relocated or resettled nation that these individuals are moving in. It expands the economy in that way. The same thing happens regionally, right, where in different parts of the world, different groups of people are aligning themselves, coalescing, okay, around similar identities, around possessing similar languages, right, around a similar ideology that is allowing them to protect their economic interests, not only for themselves, but for their entire. The ethnic road to riches. Dr. Wilson argues that solidarity is an important source of power and influence. Citing Dahl, Wilson argues that solidarity is the capacity of a member of one segment of society to evoke support from others who identify that individual member with themselves because of similarities in occupation, social standing, religion, ethnic origin, or race, right? So solidarity, much like identity, much like social consciousness, requires an awareness. It requires the awareness, right, of one individual, right, to be able to, evoke the support of others, to get other people to identify themselves with it, right? In order for the individual to be able to evoke that kind of support, the individual has to recognize itself as a part of the collective. This is that interplay between identity, consciousness, right, and solidarity. Using the 1991 census, Wilson argues that Asian American business growth from 1982 to 1987 was 6 times the national rate. Using the 1990 U.S. Census data, in the Northeast, African American population is approximately 14 times larger than that of the Chinese. The Chinese have been able to establish solid and economically viable communities, while Blacks have not. How is it that Black folks who approximately make up 14 times, right, the population size of the ethnic Chinese here in the Northeast sections of America, yet The ethnic Chinese are experiencing economic growth, economic prosperity at rates that the African American community has not seen. The difference is, according to Dr. Wilson, it's in this ethnic identity. It lies in its ethnic solidarity. This is what helps to explain why the rate of growth amongst ethnic Asian businesses demonstrate the fastest growing sector in the United States because of their ethnic identity, because of how their ethnic solidarity, they've been able to outpace all other groups. Dr. Wilson argues that it is the proactive presence of solidarity and ethnic identity in the Chinese and their relatively reactionary presence in the Black community that explains the economic development and growth or lack thereof, right? Even though the Black community is far older, contains far more social and economic resources on the whole than its Chinese counterparts. The only thing that can help to explain, right, this imbalance is the fact that the ethnic Chinese are way more ethnically organized. They display much more ethnic solidarity than do African American people. The Wall Street Journal highlighted the extremes that the ethnic Chinese were willing to employ to establish a stable social and economic community for themselves. According to this report, it showed that the ethnic Chinese prefer to patronize one another, right, which helped to drive non-Chinese shopkeepers out of business. According to this report, it was able to break down how ethnic Chinese only prefer to do business with each other, do business in-house. Other immigrant success stories, citing a story from the New York Times titled An Ethnic Road to Riches, Wilson highlights the story of Mr. Singh, a Punjabi American who left his job as a mechanic on a Greek-owned ship in 1981 and settled in New York. Once in New York, he met a fellow Punjabi who owned a gas station and taught Mr. Singh how to run and operate one of his own. By the 1990s, Mr. Singh owned 13 gas stations in the New York area, right? This is a perfect example of ethnic solidarity. You have a Punjabi American who comes to America, learns how to establish and develop a gas station. He doesn't keep that information to himself, right? He trains up another Punjabi American individual who then learns how to acquire more gas stations, right? And so it is this ethnic solidarity that breeds economic development and economic Afghan refugees, in terms of Afghan war refugees to America, who make up the smallest groups of refugees in the New York area, numbering less than 4,000 as of the printing of this book, own more than 200 fast food chicken restaurants. Despite a lack of higher education, trade skills, speaking very little English, Afghans have still become specialists in the fast food chicken business, right? We tell African American children that unless they get a college degree, unless they acquire some trade skill, unless they learn how to speak English really well or even a second or third language, that they won't really be successful in the society. And yet we see that this is not a barrier for other ethnic immigrants who come to this country, despite a lack of higher education, despite the lack of trade skills, despite speaking very little English. The Afghans have still become specialists in the fast food chicken business, thriving where others won't go. According to Dr. Wilson, uh, the Dominicans of New York have not only been successful in the grocery store industry specifically, but have also experienced significant success in the ownership of supermarkets. Wilson argues that Dominican economic growth and development can be attributed to their creating, maintaining, and serving the specific and unique ethno-cultural identity and taste of their community. There is wealth and profits to be made in only servicing one's own community by being able to tap into the unique taste, right? The unique desires, right, of African people. African businessmen and women are able to tailor their products, their services, their goods to meet those tastes, desires, wants, and wishes of its group. And so Wilson argues that the Dominican economic growth and development can be attributed to their creating, maintaining, and serving the specific and unique ethno-cultural identity and taste of their community. Who is creating, maintaining, and serving the specific and unique ethno-cultural identity of African American people? how they do it. Again, the purpose of highlighting those ethnic groups experiencing economic success in America is to serve to substantiate the fact that ethnicity can be used as a base for creating and developing economic resources. It can be done. It has been done. It is currently being done. Wilson argues that what is just as impressive as ethnic immigrants in America establishing businesses, right, is also their ability to establish these industries by developing monetary investment resources from within, developing these indigenous monetary investment programs. So where ethnic groups don't have to go to the bank or run to Western banks for money, for funding, and financing. This is really where the success story lies. And so Wilson argues, using the example of Korean immigrants in America who was looking to purchase a second greengrocer business, the selling price of the business was $28,000 with a rent of $1,500 a month. Choi was able to finance the purchasing of this second grocer not by going to the Bank of America or Chase, but by utilizing his family's means to provide the funds themselves. He went to his family. He asked his family, could they finance, right, the money for him to purchase this $28,000 grocery store, right, or be able to help him finance that $1,500 a month rent. Additionally, Wilson argues that another indigenous funding source utilized by ethnic immigrant groups and others is the money pooling K system, K-E-H, but it is pronounced K-A-Y. Wilson argues that Korean and other immigrants who found it hard to get banks to take a risk on them, the Ks have become an alternative. According to Wilson, a typical K consists of 10 to 12 people who each kick in the same amount of cash each month to a kitty. On a rotating basis, the entire kitty is loaned to the members one at a time. Each member, including the borrower, keeps up the monthly payments until every member has gotten a loan at least once. By the time the cycle is complete, each member has borrowed and paid back the whole loan. So, an indigenous practice amongst Korean immigrants is the K system. Right, and we'll see other immigrant groups have very similar systems to the K, right? But the idea is that its group members deposit a certain amount of money each month, right? And depending on who is in need or who we've determined this month is going to get this pot, we shell that out to those individuals each month. Every member is still responsible for contributing the said amount, the agreed upon amount, until every member of the group has shared in receiving the loan, right, and feeding into the system. According to Dr. Wilson, the Koreans' use of ethnic kinship and business association networks are utilized by other immigrants. The United States is a multi-ethnic nation, and ethnic divisions are reflected in ethnic differences, in social status, in economic well-being, wealth, and political power. Wilson argues that to explain ethnic differences in economic achievement, ethnic and cultural consciousness and identity cannot be overlooked. To understand why some ethnic groups have become more economically mature, have become more economically developed than others, right? To miss analyzing the way in which those groups are able to utilize their ethnic and cultural consciousness, their ethnic and cultural identities, right, is to miss the point entirely. It is the use of one's ethnic and cultural consciousness and identity that is assisting, right, in that economic development. Ethnic social structures and relations, ethnic social perceptions and other perceptions must also be taken into consideration, right? What are the ways in which those ethnic groups think about themselves, how they look at themselves? Ethnic solidarity is most important. The way in which those ethnic groups band together, the way in which they coalesce, right, to work for their own interests, where ethnic groups possess and express these factors to a high and positive degree, along with the will, the organization, and creative wherewithal to fully enter into the contested terrain of the marketplace, it greatly enhances the probability that it will win significant social, economic, political benefits for its members. So Wilson is arguing, right, that to the level that ethnic groups are able to develop their ethnic and cultural consciousness, right? Uh, their ability to be able to hone and strengthen their ethnic solidarity, right? Uh, Greatly enhances their probability, right? Um, of having political and economic success. Wilson argues that disadvantaged ethnic groups, if they possess strong or at least functional cultural and effective ties, right, they can utilize their ethnocultural organization and solidarity to subvert or to transform the nature of the economy or market for their own benefits, right? So even for oppressed folks like Black people here in America, right, if we are to strengthen um, our ethnocultural organizations, if we are to strengthen the ways in which we develop values, we develop the ways in which we celebrate our uniqueness and things of that nature, right? Then that too is going to trigger and transform the nature uh, of the economy, because now that we have this collective consciousness, we now see ourselves as a collective group. We will now start to support our ethnic businesses, our ethnic institutions, our ethnic organizations, right, in ways that we have not previously done before, because we have this strengthened consciousness now. We have this strengthened sense of group solidarity. It is going to change the nature of our economy. It's going to change the nature of our markets dramatically. Organized ethnic groups tend to act in ways that maximize the benefits and advantages that flow to the group. Once we now start to function as a group, right, we'll start to purchase as a group, we'll start to buy as a group, we'll start to sell as a group, right? And then all other non-group members will start to engage and have to interface with us differently, because we are now performing and behaving, right, as a group and no longer as individuals. Ethnic groups also tend to act in ways in which better benefit the specific interests of individual ethnic members, as well as the general interests of the ethnic group, right? So what is good for the group is good for the individual. According to Dr. Wilson, culture is an economic system. So you'll remember at the beginning of this lecture, we stated, right, that an economic system is not merely groups possessing resources of value, right? But that an economic system is a system that is mutually agreed upon, and based upon that mutual acceptance, right? Those folks decide to engage with each other in trade of some sort. According to Dr. Wilson, then an economic system is a system which produces and allocates economic resources according to the social relations, structures, values, and beliefs which characterizes it. So an economic system is a cultural system, right? Depending on the cultures that make up a particular society, they will decide which resources are of value, that they're going to trade with group members, that they're going to trade with non-group members, that they're going to not trade with non-group members, right? These are cultural decisions, right? Wilson argues that it is culture and not genetics that determines economic inputs, outputs, and distribution. Racist white propaganda would allow us to believe that it is Black folks' genetic inferiority, right? That will explain why African or Black American people have not been as economically successful as other groups in America and around the world. And Dr. Wilson is making the argument, right, that it is not due to genetics, but it has been more around our lack of our ability to be able to use our culture, right, and use our ethnicity in a particular type of way that yields economic success. Wilson claims that the entrepreneurial success stories of African immigrants rival those of other immigrant groups. So in the same ways that we've been studying the Koreans, we've saw some stories, right, with the Afghans and the Chinese, right, African immigrants as well have been able to come to America and experience great success. And it has largely been due to the fact that they've been able to utilize their ethnicity and their culture in a particular type of way. Wilson states the success of Nigerians and Senegalese immigrants in Washington, D.C. and New York City underline the roles that African culture, consciousness, and identity play in economics. For anybody who is still debating whether or not ethnicity plays a role of value and substance, right, in the economic realm, Dr. Wilson, for the last few chapters, has been trying to provide ample examples that prove that ethnicity is a tool for economic development. According to Wilson, Nigerians provided mutual financial and social support for each other's entrepreneurial undertakings through their traditional revolving credit associations or community savings clubs. So just like when we were talking about some of the other immigrant groups and the indigenous saving and financing apparatuses that they've developed within their culture, African immigrants have developed them for themselves as well in similar fashion. So just like the K system among Korean immigrants, citing a Washington Post article from 1994, Wilson argues that community saving groups called Isisus in Nigeria and Ghana, or Tontine among Senegalese and Ghanaians, are a cheap source of credit for African entrepreneurs. So, for example, 5 to 10 members of a Tontine circle might agree to contribute, let's say, Wilson used the example, $100 each for 5 to 10 weeks. Each member taking home the pot until everyone has received their share. Now, according to Wilson, the Senegalese has settled in the African American community where they found a ready market for their goods and services. When African immigrants come over to America, they don't settle in white suburbs, right? They don't settle in white rural areas and communities. They settle in the African American community. And by doing so, there is a ready-made market for them to be able to trade and sell these African goods. Wilson argues that the Nigerians, the Senegalese, and many other African nationalists have for centuries utilized their traditions of trading with African Americans, right, and other immigrant groups. Unlike African Americans, however, these traditions of trading, right, for these African immigrants, they weren't impaired in the same way that they were for African Americans due to slavery, right, due to Jim Crow, due to years of dealing with white supremacy. Africans and the descendants of Africans have lost some of these traditions of trading. They've lost some of their indigenous traditions. Not completely, not totally. But Wilson is highlighting in the ways in which African immigrants that have not been impacted, whose culture and traditional values were not impacted or impaired in the same way that they were for African Americans, right? That's important to understand. That's important to know. And for those African immigrants who traditional values were not impacted in the same way, it allows them to come to America and to be able to exploit this non-competitive class of African Americans, right? We've been discussing for the last few lectures around the ways in which the Black community has been alienated from being able to compete in the white traditional economy. Right? And because of this exclusion, right, they've been relegated to a place in America where they are this uncompetitive class, this demographic of uncompetitive bodies. They're just consumers. And thus, African immigrants are able to come over to America and exploit them in the same way that other non-African and non-Black immigrants have been able to exploit the Black community as well. According to Wilson, the Senegalese skillfully combine both class and ethnic resources in order to maximize their possibilities of business success. General ethnic identity and solidarity are used to garner the financial and material wherewithal to establish and support various enterprises, right? So it is off top, it is the identifying oneself, right, with a particular group or possessing a particular identity, right, that allows these ethnic businesses and ethnic organizations to develop, right? Wilson goes on to argue that the services, the wealth, the human capital possessed by the middle and upper classes or educated, highly skilled members of the community are recruited in order to help finance, service, manage, and ensure the economic prospects of the entire ethnic group as a whole. So within that ethnic group, those African immigrants have been able to identify the members of that group who are highly skilled, right? Who possess gifts and talents, right? That other members of the group don't, that they're able to utilize, right? These are going to be the leaders to help finance these particular trades between countries or between groups. These are going to be the spokespersons for our organizations who are going to allow us to raise money, raise funds, or bring national attention and national and international awareness to our causes, right, and to our business. Those African immigrant groups have been able to recruit that talent, put those personalities into the right positions, right, so that we can get about this work of economic development. Black American racial solidarity and economic development, right? So let's juxtapose Black American racial solidarity as after we just got done looking at, right, the African immigrant success stories of the Nigerian and the Senegalese. Dr. Wilson explains that the goal is not to leave the impression that the Black Americans are not capable of or have not experienced racial solidarity and its associated economic outcomes. Racial solidarity and self-help have a lengthy history in the Black American community and were particularly intense in the years following Reconstruction. Wilson argues that this period was also characterized by a heavy emphasis on economic development and activity as a major means of solving economic and social problems confronting the recently emancipated Black communities. Black folks have a history of being able to respond to our economic disenfranchisement. Right, we have a history of Black entrepreneurialism, right, in this country, right, and Wilson is saying, you know, I pointed to these other examples not to say that Black folks don't possess the ability, nor have they historically ever done these things, right? I just want to encourage us to get back to it, right? I want to show you what other folks are currently doing and how they're able to use our inability, our lack of using our ethnicity to our power and to our economic benefit, because we're not doing it. Other groups of people are able to benefit from it, right? Due to our ignorance. Citing August Mayer of 1966, who explained that Black conventions of the late 1870s placed their strongest emphasis on racial solidarity, self-help, and economic advancement. He goes on to explain that delegates, many of them the most distinguished leaders in the Black community, were more concerned with self-help and economic development than with the decline of political and civil rights. Mayer argued that Blacks should award their work to colored men even where white would perform it more cheaply in order to build up Black tradesmen to the point where they could compete with whites. And so Mayer was able to show that in the 1870s there was a huge premium that Black folks and Black leaders were putting on entrepreneurship, right, and economically advancing the race. There was less focus on political and civil rights, and it was more a focus on the economic development of the community, right? Wilson argues that the golden era of Black American entrepreneurialism and the operational establishment of corporate cities, industries, small businesses, and shops, professional services, schools, and universities, as well as a high level of invention by Black inventors, it reflected the emphasis on Black pride, dating from the failure of Reconstruction to the advent of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. So again, trying to place this historical time frame where we as African American people, we as Black people have always valued, right, entrepreneurialism, being business minded, being scientific, being technologically grounded. We had all of those things, and Wilson says that it was the failures of Reconstruction, right, and it was the genius, right, of a man by the name of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s that really symbolizes um, uh, a lot of this development that is happening in the African American community at this time. Um, Garvey is symbolic of this development. Wilson argues that it is evident that conscious race solidarity, a certain level of ethnocentrism and nationness, are as necessary to the entrepreneurialism, the economic growth and development of African Americans and Africans the world over as they are to non-African immigrants, white Americans, and other ethnic groups elsewhere, right? Uh, we have witnessed through this lecture and previous lectures, right? Wilson has provided us ample examples of other ethnic groups that have been able to utilize their culture to their economic benefit, right? Whereas African people have been told to forget it, right? And to just melt into the larger body politic, right, of the American society when no other group of people are doing that. Wilson argues that if African American entrepreneurialism, economic growth, and development are to occur again and reach the levels necessary not only for economic prosperity, but for the liberation from white domination, then African American race solidarity and nationalism must also be revived. The messages in Black conferences, um, within Black organizations, have to be about promoting race solidarity, right? How we are going to exhibit and demonstrate our race solidarity as a group, as a collective. We got to get back to the work of developing and reinvesting in the Black or African nation. All right, and we have to revive those aspects of our economic and political development uh, that we've since kind of lost. Immigration in the African American community. Citing Business Week 1992, Dr. Wilson argues that new immigrants to the United States compete for jobs with Americans, particularly with the less skilled, which includes the largest segment of Black workers. Black workers have to compete with immigrants that come over to America, right? And so, where we recognize the benefits of American immigration, right? We recognize the value that immigrants bring to this country. We also have to be very clear, right, and honest about the fact that when immigrants come over to this country, they're going to compete with the less skilled individuals, right, in the society. And given that African Americans have been excluded, right, from being able to compete and participate in American society as full citizens, right, African Americans then tend to be the less skilled and the less qualified for positions. Wilson argues that the influx of immigrants to the United States during the 1980s, it allows us to make inferences about the impacts of immigration on the prospects for Black American empowerment and economic well-being. What is the long-term effects of immigration to America on the African American community? According to Business Week, a 1992 report, in 1965, Congress overhauled the immigration laws that made it easier to bring relatives into the country. It became easier, right, for non-Black immigrants to come to America. A surge of immigrants came to the country from Asia and Latin America, especially from South Korea and the Philippines, right? And they had close economic and military ties to the U.S. So the United States and its government were making very strategic decisions around which immigrants they were allowing to come to the country and from what parts of the world were these immigrants coming. Over the last 10 years, the U.S. granted permanent resident status to about 1 million refugees, mostly from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Over the last 3 years, the fastest growing group of settlers have been from refugees from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So you start to see some of these trends that a lot of these immigrants were coming from Asia, they were coming from places in Latin America, or coming from Eastern Europe, right? Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, a total of some 5 million illegal immigrants from Mexico and other countries settled in this country. And in the 1980s, the proportion of illegal immigrants coming from Latin America and Asia rose from 31 to 84%, including illegal aliens granted amnesty under the 1986 law, right? And so from the 80s up until the printing of this book, we've seen a laxing, right, of the American immigration laws, right? We've seen an influx of immigrants coming in from Asia, from Latin America, and Eastern Europe. Cost and benefits of immigration. According to Wilson, immigrants provide a workforce body, right, that fills low paid jobs. Somebody's got to work these jobs. Somebody's got to take these low paid jobs, and immigrants are filling those positions. Wilson argues that despite the benefits of immigration, right, to America, immigration places an added stress on scarce resources, especially educational services. All right. Many cities are experiencing enormous difficulties in educating an exceptionally large influx of immigrant youngsters. And this is added to the problems of pre-existing overcrowding, general inadequacy and underfunding in many school systems, as well as the need to expand services to meet the special needs of immigrant school children, right? There's already a lack of resources in public schools, in public education. And to add new bodies to the public school system, to add new students, new families to an already underfunded, under-resourced institution, it means that those folks that are already there are going to have to now compete with this new influx of bodies, this new influx of students, this new influx of families into its system. A system that's already struggling to educate its current citizens, its current student body. And now you add a new body of students who speak a different language, who possess a different culture, and you add stress to an already overstressed environment, institution, and organization. Who suffers? Those immigrant children for sure, right? The teachers are obviously not prepared to meet the needs of this new student body, right? These teachers and school leaders may or may not speak that language, but we have to be honest about the student body that was already previously there. They too are going to suffer. They're going to suffer the consequence of trying to now meet the needs and fund and resource this new student body at the expense of the students' families and community that has already been involved in that school, with that organization, and with that institution. Wilson argues that we cannot deny that there is a struggle between African Americans and newcomers over jobs and access to scarce public and private resources. Many African Americans, 73% according to the Business Week / Harris poll, believe that the success of immigrants has in good part come at the expense of the Black community. They also believe that both white-owned and immigrant-owned businesses would rather hire immigrants than African Americans, especially African American males, right? And so this Business Week Harris poll, when polling the African American community and asking them about how they viewed the most recent impact, right, of immigrants to the United States, they believe that that was happening at their expense, right? And that not just immigrant-owned businesses, but that white-owned businesses as well, right, would prefer to hire immigrants, non-Black folks, to their institutions, to their businesses. Black folks were recognizing that a game was being played and that immigrants, recent immigrants to America, were aligning with white interests. They were aligning with white business practice. According to Dr. Wilson, many African Americans have retrospectively come to see immigration as exploitative to the Black community. Looking back on it, analyzing it, Black folks have seen immigration to be a disservice to the Black community. Non-African or non-Black businesses hire few community residents. They enter into few business partnerships and other mutually beneficial arrangements with local residents. They refuse to reside in the community where they do business. And this demonstrates, Wilson argues, this demonstrates the same anti-Black attitudes and prejudices as do native-born white Americans. Native-born white Americans don't do business in our community. They don't live in our community, right? They don't invest in our communities. They take. So Wilson argues it is clear that the immigrant and non-Black owners of the business and service organizations which thrive in African American communities or serve predominantly African American clients, they do not reside in the community. They provide very little financial support to the community, and as a result, help to intensify the hypersegregation, economic, and social isolation of African Americans. These immigrant Americans who set up shop in our business, who refuse to hire folks in our business, who practice hostile business practices toward Black folks in community, have end up becoming business partners with the dominant white racist economic model that currently exists in America. Wilson says it is clear that the immigrant and non-Black owners of the business and service organizations which thrive in our communities, they have very little intentions on investing in our communities, right? And are doing nothing but helping to intensify the current issues and current problems that already exist in our communities. Wilson states that without malice toward non-community, immigrant, and native-born non-resident owners of inner-city businesses and services, we must acknowledge that the tremendous outflow of monetary, human, material, and non-material resources from the African-American inner-city communities at the hands of these agents, in addition to the institutional racist practice of the nation as a whole, cannot but grievously harm these communities. Immigration is doing a disservice to the Black community. Many of these immigrant business owners are doing the exact same stuff that white business owners do in our communities and are benefiting in the exact same ways. We simply must be honest, and in being honest, this has nothing to do with being anti-immigration. Let's be clear. We can recognize the value that immigration does for America. We can recognize the value that immigration does for the country while simultaneously talking about what immigration and how it negatively impacts certain groups in this country. Wilson reminds us that it can be demonstrated that throughout the history of the United States, immigrant groups, first white ethnics, followed by non-white ethnics, have benefited from racist governmental and private social practices and restrictions against Black Americans. If Blacks could not possess land, title, or equity, somebody else benefited from that exclusion. If Black soldiers could not benefit from the same GI Bills that white soldiers were able to benefit from, then white families, right, and others benefited from that lack of Black competition. Wilson argues that immigrant American groups were major participants in erecting the racial codes that excluded qualified Blacks from jobs. White ethnics in large numbers not only used the political system to their economic advantage, but also were prime actors in politically disenfranchising Blacks and in unconstitutionally manipulating state power to prevent Blacks from voting, to prevent Blacks from influencing the political process. The same discriminatory governmental and social practices, which, as in the past, wrecked the strong Afro-American service businesses, right, that were developing since the 1700s, were replaced with other ethnic businesses. These same tactics are still being used and operated against Black economic interests today. Just got to be clear about that. The same discriminatory social practices that were practiced by white folks in the past are still being operated, right, against Black folks today. And it is not just white folks doing that work. To be clear, solutions. The impact of immigration on the African American community's power and socioeconomic prospects must be realistically and objectively faced up to by the African American community. Right? Wilson is arguing here that we have to be honest about the cost of immigration to the Black community. There's been some benefits to America, right? but there have been a lot of negative cost to the African American community, and we have to be clear about this, right? Wilson goes on to say that this customarily liberal sharing community, right, the African American community, must confront the fact that in its relative poverty and powerlessness, it cannot afford to continue to permit its vital resources to be commandeered by its aliens. We cannot allow, right, for immigrants or any other group of people to continue to suck blood and resource and time, right, from our communities. It must aggressively accumulate external earnings, retain as much of its internal resources as possible, and invest in itself first. That's got to be the work that we're doing, right? We have to aggressively accumulate external earnings, retain as much of our internal resources as possible, and invest in ourselves first. If it is to survive and prosper throughout the coming centuries, taking us back to the Black personality needing to be re-socialized so that we put our interests first, right, and not those of other individuals, the African American community must enhance its political power to the degree that it can effectively influence U.S. internal and external policies in its own interest and the interests of African people worldwide. So in the same way that we talked about that white corporate class and their ability to be able to utilize lobbying, right, and some of these internal bureaucracies to work for their economic and political interests, we as African people are going to have to organize ourselves to do the exact same thing, right? Or tear it down and recreate a totally different system. Wealth and power. According to Dr. Wilson, there is a substantial positive correlation between ethnic self-centered identity and the accumulation of wealth and political as well as other forms of power. Citing Davis, Swinton, Wilson argues that the persisting inequality in the current economic status of Black Americans, it reflects the persistence of limited economic power. Right? So the inequality that Black folks are experiencing in America and the world over can be linked to its lack of economic power. Citing Swinton, Wilson argues that power flows from the ownership of human and non-human capital, and that the empowerment of the African American community to obtain and maintain economic parity through its own efforts will be impossible without the elimination of large and glaring disparities in wealth ownership. So Wilson is making the argument that it is going to be almost impossible for Black folks to achieve economic parity, right? To get on the same level with white folks economically in this country, right? While white supremacy is still allowed to run rampant. While all of these other forms of discrimination and disparities, right, are active in American society. It is going to be impossible for Black folks to ever achieve that type of economic parity, right? Until we destroy white supremacy. Until we are able to do something about the mass redistribution of wealth. And until we start to think in those terms, right, we will remain being dominated by other groups. Hashtag never forget. Isn't it curious, Wilson asks, that ethnic African Americans are taught and motivated to realize the very opposite values. They are taught and motivated that they should downgrade or deny their ethnicity, that they are not to develop an African-centered culture, that they should assimilate themselves out of existence, and practice no level of ethnic exclusion. They're taught that they should allow all other groups to monopolize their markets. Taught that to support their own business and community first is to engage in reverse racism. Wilson wants us to understand that this is foolish thinking, and it benefits the dominant corporate class, the white elite, for Black folks to think this way. It surely does not benefit Black people to think in this particular type of way. The White Brotherhood Collective, then, According to Dr. Wilson, the archetypical white brotherhood collective, like the brotherhood collectives which characterizes other ethnic groups, are based on commonalities of ethnicity, culture, values, and goals. Don't let white folks tell you they don't have a culture, right? Don't let white folks make you believe that they all act as individuals, right? They are a group based on commonalities of their ethnic group and values and goals. Wilson argues that the white brotherhood collective functions primarily as the central instrument of white power. Okay? White power, or power in good part, based on its subordination and exploitation of African and other non-white peoples, as well as the lower classes of white people. Therefore, blacks cannot simultaneously be at one with and at the same time separate subjects of white power. Please understand, right? Black folks, you are not a part of American society. You are not an equal, right, to a white American citizen. Blacks cannot simultaneously be at one with and at the same time separate subjects of white power. We are arguing, and Wilson has been arguing, right, for these last few chapters, right, that African people, black people, are dominated by whites in this country. So we can't simultaneously be at one with a society and culture that we are also being dominated by. Let's keep. Citing J.C. Smith, Wilson argues that a monopoly is the essence of power. And according to Wilson, the exercise of power by the white American ruling elite requires that it retains a monopoly of three kinds of power. It needs a monopoly of physical and or military power. It wants a monopoly of economic power and a monopoly of ideological power. Wilson argues that power in America is possessed and controlled by a single interlocking structure of power, a power elite whose power is concentrated at the top of three domains: the corporation, the government, right, and military organizations. Wilson argues that the brotherhood in which we are most interested at this moment is the corporate brotherhood of the white male collective, right? So what we're discussing when we're talking about the white male brotherhood, we're talking about the corporate white male brotherhood, just to be clear. The corporate brotherhood of white male collective, the brotherhood of producers, merchants, and bankers who organize and control economic power. Wilson argues that the insatiable drive to accumulate wealth, which defines capitalism, and the white male corporate brotherhood is synonymous with the drive to dominate, to exercise power primarily through the withholding or granting of capital. According to Wilson, the insatiable drive to accumulate as much wealth as possible is synonymous with the white drive, right, to dominate all other groups of people. Accumulating mass wealth and domination for Wilson, right, are one and the same. Thus, the free market capitalism, the central source of power of the white brotherhood collective, cannot be truly free, and access to it not be really freely available to all other groups and subject people, right? If the market was truly free and open, right, and subject people were allowed to compete in those markets, right, then the status quo wouldn't be what the status quo is. The corporate white elite would not possess the power and the resources that they have. The market system as created and monopolized by the white brotherhood collective is an economic instrument by which the white male corporate elite disciplines and orders American society. We discussed in chapter 12 how recessions are engineered to discipline organized labor. We also discussed the ways in which big businesses and corporations have relocated their companies and businesses in other countries as a way to discipline organized labor, so that when folks strike and they step off their jobs, they can just increase labor, right, increase production in other countries to compensate for that loss of labor, right, in America. The market system is the white brotherhood collective's instrument of power and social control. Its primary instrument of maintaining the racial and social inequalities that are essential to its very existence and functionality. According to Wilson, the white brotherhood collective uncontested monopoly of capital, and the dominating power it undergirds rests largely on a would-be Black Brotherhood collective in its habit of subordination, right? Its habit of subordinating its individuality, its unwillingness to use its identity as a basis for acquiring capital and property. White folks, this white corporate class, they're able to maintain their dominance. They're able to maintain their power because the Black would-be Brotherhood collective, we haven't been able to formalize a collective yet because we haven't developed our consciousness yet. We haven't developed our awareness yet. We haven't socialized ourselves and our young, right, to identify with African interests, African leadership, African objectives. And so because of this, there is a would-be Black Brotherhood collective. There's not even a Black Brotherhood collective that exists currently yet because of white dominance. The Black Brotherhood collective, or as Dr. Wilson will refer to it, right, as a network. Wilson argues that the proliferation of male fraternal organizations throughout the world and throughout history reflects a male complex which derives the male to band together into close-knit groups, right? So folks will notice that whether it was the Asian Brotherhood collective or the white male or the white Brotherhood collective, excuse me, or this Black Brotherhood collective, you will recognize that all three of these are gendered, right? These are masculine conceptualizations, right? Although we recognize that an Asian Brotherhood possesses women, right? Women are a part of that membership, right? The reality that Wilson is arguing is that most of these economic organizations and these economic businesses the world over are ran and led by men, right? And so they have that male complex in that regard. Whether these are sacred priesthoods, monastic orders, military orders, secret societies, fraternal orders, or merely private men's clubs, they are products of behavior which reflects a psychological basis. And so Wilson is making this argument as to why, or historically why, these organizations and collectives have been male-centric. Is the Black Brotherhood truly a collective? Citing the Business Week 1993 publication titled Inside the Black Business Network, Wilson argues that a web of entrepreneurs and executives is driving African American economic growth. This network is predominantly composed of African American males, 40 of them being men, 4 are female. Included in this Brotherhood collective were folks like John Johnson of Johnson & Johnson, General Colin Powell, Bill Cosby, Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson, Magic Johnson, and Spike Lee. Wilson argues that despite its ethnicity, there's some serious doubts as to its deeply rooted connections with the African American community in particular, and the worldwide African community in general. How connected was Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson, let's say, to Africa, right? And Africans throughout the diaspora? How connected was Bill Cosby or General Colin Powell, right, or Bob Johnson, let's say, to Africans throughout the diaspora? Wilson argues that he doubted that they were deeply rooted, right, or that they had a full commitment to enhancing the lives and the power of African peoples across the diaspora. And so in that regard, we couldn't truly say that it's a Black Brotherhood collective. Wilson argues that their assimilationist orientations, their client status relative to their white patrons and sponsors, and their need to be fully accepted in white society in order to acquire wealth, freedom, and respectability to achieve their acceptance into the white corporate elite as honorary white men. It requires their self-negation, their self-alienation, and the transcendence of their race. We cannot, with any level of seriousness, say that our Black celebrities, Black actors, Black athletes are rooted in the causes of advancing African economic and political interests the world over. Many of these men and women are extremely wealthy and rich agents of Western businesses, of Western models, of Western agencies. And so Wilson is questioning and encouraging us to question many of these Black celebrities, many of which who will also come in the name of Africa, who will come in the name of social justice initiatives, but we will still need to question their authenticity in terms of their connection with these, with the African community, with the African diaspora the world over. Solutions. If the network, because the Black community is not truly a collective yet, if the Black network would regain its common sense and apprise itself of history of how the world works, how financial empires and great ethnic and national economies have and truly built and protected itself, it would realize that its attempt to gain entry into the white corporate elite by cutting itself off from its cultural and ethnic base is foredoomed for failure. So one of the solutions that Wilson is proffering here is that Black folks got to study history. We got to analyze history and recognize that all other ethnic groups have utilized their culture, right, and cultural commonalities, right, as a way to advance themselves economically and politically and culturally and socially throughout the world. And to do the opposite, right, is to set oneself up for failure. The network suffers from a massive and inexcusable lack of understanding of the workings of the White American Brotherhood collective, as well as of its economic underpinnings. We have not effectively analyzed and studied the ways in which the White American Brotherhood operates politically and economically in this country as a way to neutralize them. I'm not studying the White American Brotherhood as a way to put them on a pedestal and to simply mimic their behaviors and their actions and orientations. We want to analyze them so that we can destroy their dominance and put an end to their dominance over us. According to Dr. Wilson, if a Black Brotherhood collective is to successfully counter this group, it too must, in no uncertain terms, proclaim its Africanicity and act in terms of its group identity. We as African people are going to have to reclaim our Africanicity. We got to reclaim our ethnic, cultural commonalities, right? And we're going to have to display that proudly on the economic stage. Each of its members too must merge the self into the group and merge the group into itself. We talked about group identity. We talked about group consciousness. And in order for that to really be strengthened, African people are going to have to strengthen their awareness around the fact that they are, in fact, a part of a group, right? And we are no longer operating in the interest of our individual selves, but for the collective interest, right? This Black Brotherhood collective must gain the loyal fellowship of its community by being the community's primary patron, protector, and nurturer, right? We recognize that every organization can't be the end all be all, right, for Black folks, right? But where Black businesses, where these African networks are associated, right, and situated throughout the country, throughout the world, we recognize that it is the role of those networks to do by the community. We cannot expect, and we should not expect alone the government and its social services programs to do for community. This Black African network, this Black Brotherhood collective, right, will be working to end white domination, right? So it's working to put into place, right, personalities that can solve some of our own issues. All right. This Black Brotherhood collective must become the primary arbiter of African community values, beliefs, ideologies, modes of consciousness, taste, and desires, as it acts to facilitate the ownership and control of its internal markets, right? Other ethnic groups have been able to develop the resources, right, that are unique to that ethnic group, that are valued by that ethnic group, right? And they promote and sell them within the group as well as to non-group members. We as African people have to get organized in that way. What are the resources? What are the goods? What are the products that we value, right, that we use We recognize that non-group members, they value, they use as well, right? What are those products? What are those things? Let's organize it. Let's create the economic rules of engagement around those products, around those resources. Right? This Black African collective must facilitate the increases in the community savings rate so that it can accumulate large amounts of capital and property under the control of its own financial institutions. So whether it was the Korean K's, right, or whether it was the Nigerian and Senegalese, Tontine, and Isuzu indigenous savings and financing practices, we as African people are going to have to develop that, right? Who are 5 or 10 people in your family, in your network that you can get to put money into a pocket, right? And month to month, we decide who that pot goes to. All right, we have to develop those indigenous means of financing, right? Our own economic and political agendas. I want to thank you all for your time with this lecture on Chapter 14, Race and Economics. I look forward to your time and your attention as we jump into our next lecture, Chapter 16, Trading and Investing on African Nations. Thank you, family.